Hello and welcome to this mini educational office ergonomics video where we'll talk about what we already know about how to make office ergonomics or offices as healthy and productive as possible and what we have yet to learn. I'm Dr. Nancy Black. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering at Université de Moncton, and I am both a professional engineer and a certified Canadian professional ergonomist. You see at the bottom of this current slide that there are different postures that we use over the course of the day, and that's absolutely normal. And that's part of what I want to take away from what we're doing is to demystify what is good and what is less good. So for today, we'll be talking about the context of office work, some of the risks that we know exist, what the options are in terms of improving or attenuating those risks, and what recommendations we have for people doing office work. We'll also talk about the study that we are currently engaged in, so what we're yet learning, where we'll talk about the conditions that we'll be testing, the equipment involved, and the benefits and risks. So to start off with a little bit more, making sure that we all understand what ergonomics is, and the International Ergonomics Association has created this definition where it talks about the harmonization of things that people interact with and taking into account the person's needs, abilities, and limitations. So we're taking the person as a whole. We aren't trying to change the person, but rather looking at how the person acts relative to their job, relative to the products that we supply for them to use, relative to the tasks that we ask them to do in their organizational environment and in the physical environment that they work. The Association of Canadian Ergonomists has created a definition similar, but that puts a bit of focus on something else. So it talks about the interactions, again, between the humans and other things, people, environment, objects, but it emphasizes this goal of optimizing both human well-being and system performance. So that's the context we have going into office environments applying ergonomics. Why is this so important? Well, because more and more of us are using computers and indeed the internet in our working context, whether that be at home or whether that be at whatever environment we work. In 2003, so almost 20 years ago now, there was a study in the United States which looked at how many people used a computer at work. And you see that at that time, already on average, 55% of the population used a computer at work and somewhat less used the internet. That's not so important to us anymore because we know the internet is everywhere. When we look more recently at the progression over time, in the UK we see that back in 2007, the numbers of people using internet at their workplace was somewhere between 45 and 35%, but that has steadily increased to a point where we're now between 60 and 70% with really any size of different company. This one data point is a bit of an outlier, and I'm not too concerned about it, especially when we look at from the Statistica compilation of data about households with a computer in developed countries. So that means basically any economically strong country, and you see that we're almost at 80% in recent years. So not only are we using those computers at our workplace, up to about 70% or thereabouts, but at home as well, we are doing so. Very, very ubiquitous. But so what are the risks of doing work with a computer? The first is that we tend to be sedentary when we're doing computer work. And when one is sedentary, there are health risks. In the first year of changing from a physically active workplace to one where one is sitting down largely or moving very little, there is 3 times the chance of having a cardiovascular event, a heart attack or something along those lines. And that has been seen over and over again. Furthermore, the more one sits, the worse one's metabolic health is. So one's physiology actually adapts to the fact that one is not moving, and that leads to things like I have the same sandwich I've always had, but I start to grow wide a bit more. And how much do we sit? Well, back in 2003 already, when they looked at people at work, about 75% of the day, so 6 hours out of 8, was spent sitting. And that again is tending to increase over time. Another study looking at the 24-hour-a-day clock found that around 55% of the day when one was awake, one was seated. And indeed, if we talk about workplaces where really you're stuck with a computer, call centers is one of those, and we know it well here in New Brunswick. In those environments, 80% of one's workday tends to be seated, and we're using computers intensively. We do change posture, getting up, sitting down, walking a bit, and that actually happens pretty frequently in that it's about 10 times an hour on average, but those changes are of very brief duration and they don't all occur spaced out in an even way over the course of the day. So here we see on the right-hand side the variety of different workplaces, and you notice that as we go forward in time, things are becoming more different and allowing one to do work. So if we look, though, at that second workplace sort of area where we have a good chair, a keyboard tray, this is what we have discovered when we observed people over the course of a workday. We put markers on them and we asked them to just continue to do their work, and we ran the video camera. And so we had about 1/3 of the time where people were in the neutral posture, head above shoulders, arms about the same height as the working surface, so all looked good. But about 1/3 of the time, again, one was slouched. And then there was a period, not insignificant, where one was in a more extreme posture, but again static, is this seated translation. And in that posture, what's particularly concerning is the neck, because one has this tendency to put it into an extension, and the neck is forward of the shoulders. In these studies, we were using video, and so we couldn't see what people were doing if they weren't at their workstation. And indeed, about 1/4 of the time, people moved away from their work surface. So part of what we need to know is what are people doing, in fact, over the course of their working days, whether or not they're in their regular work environment. So we know that people 25% of the time were moving somewhat, and indeed that is something that we want to encourage. When one has a data entry task, so there is no reason to move, studying the muscular activation, my colleague Linda McLean and colleagues found that the muscular activation actually took little breaks, periodic breaks, about once every 20 minutes, no more than once every 40 minutes. So while the person was continuing to work, their body was taking these breaks, even if they were not. As a result of that work, we came out with the general recommendation that you should be taking brief breaks, and so we call those micro breaks. They could be 20 seconds, 30 seconds, but be physically active in those few seconds, and that will help you, in fact, work better. And so we found that when people took micro breaks, about every 20 minutes, there was no degradation in the productivity that they did, and they felt better. Another interesting complement is some work that was done by Fenity and Walker, who are physiotherapists, and they discovered that people when they move, they tend to move more if they are uncomfortable. And on the opposite side of that, when one moves in proactive fashion, there is less discomfort that develops. So things like workstations which allow you or support change, like between sit and stand, are indeed a positive element. But they don't necessarily do enough. As Wilkes' study there points out, people tend to stand somewhat more, but is that enough? So we did a study a few years ago where we looked at the traditional seated static workstation, and we compared that with a workstation that you see in the upper right here, where the work surface was able to indeed move up and down, as well as in and out and around the person, so in a rotational fashion. So we called that workstation a dynamic workstation, and it moved periodically on a 20-minute cycle, up, down, side to side, in and out. And we asked, or we observed rather, people's posture in their entirety, and as well the neck posture, because the neck is an area which we tend to develop discomfort in office type environments. I want you to look then at the static and the dynamic columns for each of these two body areas. And you'll notice that the sit slouch goes from 35% when one is continuously sitting down to less than half of that, with a little bit of a stand slouch here when one is in this dynamic posture. Or otherwise stated, we move from 27% sit neutral to 18 plus 26% standing neutral and sitting neutral. Either way, you've got about twice as much in a neutral posture relative to the slouching posture. When one looks at neck posture specifically, we have the neck forward is a problem, as are all of extension and flexion. So what we really want is to see more neutral posture. And indeed, that's what we saw when we forced people to take regular dynamic breaks. We went from about 25% up to almost 50%. And indeed, these sorts of results have led to changes in the way in which we talk about office ergonomics, and the CCOHS, the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, has this great series of suggestions for people's workplaces. But what I want you to emphasize or notice here is that among the presentations that they have both a seated and a standing workstation with the computer, so to normalize that as being what one really should be working toward, movement in the workplace. So let's talk a little bit more about what we know in terms of standing and moving and what has already been researched. We know that if people are aware of the benefits of moving, then they will tend to move more. So that's training. That's what we're doing right now. If we supply reminders for them, that too tends to increase movement and decrease discomfort. Having a workstation which encourages movement, so for example, sit-stand workstations are the most common these days, that helps. Also, when you take your breaks, I've already mentioned that it is important to take brief breaks regularly, and that is better than taking one long break, as is often suggested according to our contracts, and then sitting all the rest of the time. So you don't want to do that. You want to take the brief breaks. And we need to alternate regularly. The most recent global recommendation that I have seen comes from a recommendation by experts, which suggests one should at least be standing 25% of the time if one is in an otherwise seated workplace, and one should go toward 50% on a regular basis. And that should be equally spaced again over the course of the day. How much or how exactly to do that has been the study of a number of different research projects, including some that I've been involved in. And the most recent one is this last one where we looked at different durations on a 30-minute cycle to see whether there was something that was better. And really, depending on the person, you've got everything from 6 minutes out of 30 that's excellent to 15 minutes out of 30. And what people prefer tends to vary too, and it doesn't necessarily correspond to the best posture in terms of maintaining that neutral posture. Okay, so now we've talked about what those research projects have shown to date, but what can you actually get? How can you make this work in your place? So the first thing one could do is have a workplace which is a fixed surface but with a keyboard tray that allows you to move that, a good chair that is adjustable in the vertical so that you can have your visual field just below the horizontal directly in front of you. Pretty good. Okay, a number of different elements there. One could alternatively, to support the sit-stand changes, have something like this one here, which is actually from human scale and attaches to your desk. So the desk is a fixed height, but this surface here moves with your screen up and down, encouraging bringing your work area completely up and completely down. So the work table remains, but your work surface actually moves. Along those lines, so that's a manual system where you pull it up and down. One could instead have a system like this one, where these two surfaces are able to be moved up and down with an electrical button, just a little controller. So very easy to move, and that's interesting because in this case the workplace has each one of these two surfaces completely independently movable, so it makes it quite easy to move. They still have a very generous chair with a good backrest, the lumbar back with its curve here. People don't actually tend to stand that much. That's again a challenge. This is the workstation that I was talking to you about before, where it goes up, down, in, side to side, and in and out. So that's another option. As is this one, which is not dynamic. It's got a surface that you lean back on and basically are standing up on a cushioned surface, and you raise the surface that you're working on so that you are standing but with some support. One of the interesting things we found when we studied this was that people tended to get uncomfortable after about 45 minutes, so they got up and moved. Not necessarily bad. And finally, the workstations that we're going to be studying in the course of this project are sit-stand, height adjustable, electrically powered desk and an under-the-desk bike. So we'll talk a little bit more about those options after we finished with the recommendations. So, office ergonomics. What do you want when you're talking about the things that you're interacting with? First thing is head above shoulders, directly above. As I've already mentioned, your eyes should be slightly lower than the horizontal to see the region that you are going to be working with on your computer screen. If it's beyond that area, one tends to move one's neck to compensate because your eyes are the first thing that we want to make happy. The second thing is the back should be supported with the backrest with, again, this curve inside in the lower back where we have a very flexible area of your back. And that promotes that curve, but know that just by sitting down and having this angle, which is typically slightly over 90 degrees, then this flattening of the back is just a natural change. But having a support will assist in not having your back fatigue as much. In terms of your arms, the elbow should be at somewhat more than 90 degrees. The wrist should be straight when you are doing your typing or your mousing. And all of that should be straightforward as well, not deviated one way or another. So about 90 degrees, 0 degrees in your wrist. Here in the hips, slightly more than 90 degrees again, up to 120. Similarly for the knees, slightly more than 90. And then finally, your feet should be supported on the ground rather than hanging in the air. I've got a couple other points here. You should be adjusting your chair throughout the day regularly, and similarly adjusting the workstation if you can. So moving it up and down. Again, movement is good. Now, what other things can support movement? We've got things like a cycling workstation, like this under the desk bike that we were just talking about. And some research recently in 2019 compared such tools with a walk station where one is walking on a treadmill or a continuously standing, just static workstation. And they found that simple processing tasks, so cognitive thinking, was better and faster, and one felt more aroused, so awake, when using the cycling as compared to a standing workstation. If we go a bit further with that under the desk bike idea, there has been some research about that, and they found that having access to such a tool does help to reduce the periods that one is sedentary amongst office workers. It also tends to improve attention, work performance, and worker motivation. You'll notice that that didn't happen for everyone, but it happened for at least half the population, according to this study in 2017. Finally, why just use a tool around us? What about something that can interact with us and encourage us even more? And that's the idea around gamification. So with an interface that is fun to use, then training and cognitive assessments tended to be more enjoyed as opposed to feeling like they were an effort, a frustration, or just repetitive. So that sounds good. Cognitive training. People tend to be more motivated and engaged. On the other hand, they may perceive that the demands that are being made of them or the difficulty also increases. So some positive and some less positive. It may help, that sort of tool, to change behavior in sitting workers, so reminding them to change their posture, and may also increase enjoyment and productivity at work. So what we're asking in the current study is really if using that under the desk bike and gamification results in the best postural changes. As I mentioned, we're starting this off with this ergonomics, office ergonomics sensitivity course. We'll then be asking you some questions around pre-existing discomfort, the way in which your work occurs, so that we understand where you're coming from. We'll then also visit you on site to ensure that your workstation is in as best an layout as possible to respect those ergonomics recommendations, and we'll adjust as it is feasible. And then over the following 4 weeks, we'll be testing 4 different conditions. The first one uses your regular workstation, and we'll just measure your a number of elements during that week. Then we'll have 2 weeks where we measure how you work when using the ergonomics workstation and the under the desk bike, or that same workstation and under the desk bike with the gamified app. And finally, after those 2 weeks, we will remove the workstation that comes from ergonomics and ask that you use again your regular workstation and see how it has affected your behavior, if it has. Finally, there'll be an interview at the end just to again understand how you perceived this whole study and the options that we were providing you with. I mentioned a physical discomfort questionnaire. That's really important, so it will be repeated prior to the study, at the end of each one of the weeks, and then at the end of the study. And that we want to know where you have discomfort, how intense and how frequently you have it, and if it's related to your work according to your perception. Then during the regular work weeks of the study, at the beginning and end of each day, will send you, or will ask you to fill in a questionnaire, which is on the web, electronically administered. And basically you just click off what value on a scale of 0 to 10 do you feel in terms of stiffness, fatigue, neck pain, back pain, etc. And that way we have an idea of how you're feeling all around your body. We'll also ask a couple of other questions on this daily questionnaire. Shouldn't take more than 5 minutes total with morning and evening to ensure that we understand what may be different about today versus yesterday. We'll also, throughout the regular work week, be measuring your physical activity. And that's done with, well, it looks here like a watch, although we'll be putting it on your thigh as you can see here. So it's a very small unit that is on an elastic band, and it just measures whether you're standing, sitting, cycling, or walking. And then once a week, we will come in and do some more detailed measurements of your posture and your physiology. So we'll be measuring your heart rate variability with a thoracic belt that you'll wear under your clothing. And then the posture is measured again with these little sensors that are worn on the person throughout their body to ensure that we see all the different principal areas of the body. So 1 hour for that. In all of these cases, nothing can harm you in any way. This one, very light. You put it on in the morning, you take it off in the evening. And these ones, again, we will be installing for you. Again, no possibility of anything shocking you or anything like that. And they're very light, very small. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. Please, if you have any questions, reach out, and know that this research has been funded by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada and the company that fabricates the workstations that we're looking at, Ergonomics Technologies. It's also received funding for equipment that includes the sensors we're using from the NBIF. Any questions? Please reach out. I'll look forward to hearing from you.